only important during the debate, but setting up your page and your prepared notes will help to better understand the debate and better prepare you for your speech. So making sure that, you don't just have a bunch of random words written down, you don't just have like lists, making sure that your page looks like something that will be accessible to you. So it looks like something that's easy to understand. And this will be different for every person, but making sure you really write down those key ideas. You don't want to just say something really good in prep and then totally forget it and be like, oh, what was that great thing that Hannah said in prep, and I think that could really beat this argument. You don't want to feel like in the middle of the round you don't have that. One thing I would say is when you're just taking your initial notes is to make sure you leave lots of room underneath them. So typically if my page is here, I'll do like, okay, point 1, I'll leave like 3 lines, point 2, because then you can go back afterward and fill in that analysis or fill in the explanation of your points, and you don't have to rewrite everything again. And like I said, write down ideas as soon as you get them, just as they are. Brainstorm doesn't need to be perfect. You just need something on your page to work with. And don't forget to write down all the framing you'll include. I think especially for like prime minister or leader of opposition, kind of those first 2 speakers, it's really easy to just be like, oh, I understand this round, so I don't need to write down the framing of the round because it's just like it makes sense to me. But I find especially if I just like instinctively or like right away understand what the motion should be about or what I have to argue, I'll often forget to explain it to other people in the round because I'm like, well, I know what it is, like everybody else should. But make sure, because you're prime minister, this is like a part of your role. You're supposed to set up the round. You're supposed to make sure that everybody in the round is under the same impression or understands that they're all under the same idea of what it's going to be. So that's a really big part of prime minister that I think is like overlooked. Yeah, so that's that idea of taking notes. Does anybody have any questions or comments so far? Is this feeling like familiar to you guys? Thumbs up if it feels familiar, maybe. Feeling okay, feeling a bit familiar. Okay, cool. So hopefully then this will help some more. So independent brainstorm. So our first 1 to 3 minutes when we're alone, let's pretend that the motion that we have in front of us was this house would make fines relative to wealth. So like, if you get a parking ticket, if you are super rich, your parking ticket is like $5,000 if you park wrong on the street. But let's say you don't have a lot of money, you're like a student in school and you have a ton of loans, you're trying to be a doctor, but you have tons of student loans, your parking ticket's $5. So that's what we're talking about. Do we think that depending on how much money you have, how many resources you have, if you get a parking ticket or if you, speed over the limit, should you have a different kind of fine? So then I guess what you would ask yourself in this situation as like the independent brainstorming, what I would automatically do is I would just ask myself general questions about the round. So I'd ask like, how do we ensure that the punishment is distributed in a way that equally affects each person? So this is kind of, I'm sure, the basics of the round where it's like, do we think that everybody should have the same punishment? So everybody should have to pay $25 when they're doing, a crime like parking in the wrong place or driving too fast on the highway? Or do we think that, it should be dependent on how much money you have, how much like disposable income you have, how badly it would affect you? Because obviously for some people, if you were fined $100, be no big deal. But for other people, $100 is really a big deal, right? I'm sure for you guys as kids, right? If somebody just asked you for like $200 right now, that would be a lot harder than if they asked your parents for that, right? Just because you guys don't have jobs, right? That's pretty difficult. So yeah, it's thinking about that, thinking about where people come from. And then I guess the next question would be, what are fines used for, right? So when the city and when the government, when the police take away that money from you, where does it go, right? So, and how can it be best used? So if parking tickets, for example, if that money goes towards like building new roads, do we want there to be a lot of parking tickets? Do we care how many parking tickets there are, how much money is made? Those are questions that you want to ask. And then the last one is less likely to avoid the crime itself, right? So if we think about it, you probably like, there's a reason that people get parking tickets. It's because they're parking in places that they shouldn't be, right? So sometimes that's because if they park there, it could be dangerous for other cars. Sometimes it's like if they park somewhere, they don't pay for it. That's like somebody's property. So then our question becomes, do we want to like make it so the most amount of money is spent, the most amount of people pay? Do we care about that? And then kind of thinking, okay, how do we move forward? And how does that work? So yeah, does this make sense to everybody? These are just general questions that we ask ourselves when we're trying to prepare. And I think a lot of the times, if we ask ourselves a more broad question about the round, it's easier to find more fulfilling arguments. And you ask yourself that question by just kind of understanding like generally what the motion is asking and then playing that out on the paper or with your partner. So then in terms of sharing notes, each partner should have between 2 to 3 points that they believe could work. So the goal would be, you know, maybe from that last motion we were just looking at, my first point is about like how to make people's money go super far. So how do we get the most amount of money for our cause? And then the second one could be, how do we make this about equality? So how do I make it so that people who are poor don't have to pay more than people who are wealthy in comparison to how much money they have? So those could be my 2 ideas. And I would bring them to my partner. Let's say Richard's my partner. And I tell him, these are my 2 ideas. What are your ideas? And he says, I actually have very similar ideas to you. I had the same ideas, but maybe I have a different reason for why they're important. So then together we'd say, okay, well, these are our ideas. And now we're going to flesh them out. So we're not just going to say our points in our speech, you know, people should have to pay just, you know, depending on how much money they have, right? But it should be more than that. It should be, why should people just have to pay what they have? Or why do we care that some people are rich and some people are poor and that impacts them differently? So we want to really talk about why we think these things are important and also what the impact is. So how does this affect people? What does this happen in the long term? Normally, the ones that overlap, like I said, are the ones that are typically the most relevant to the round if you both thought of it. Or sometimes it's like maybe Richard has 2 ideas that are pretty, you know, good ideas, but they're standard to the round. And then I know a lot about parking tickets for some reason. And I'm like, actually, I have this brilliant extension idea about parking tickets. Somehow I know all that. I read a whole book about parking tickets. And then I can just pull that out. And then we can consider what we think is probably better, or if we're on the closing team, if that extension would work. Then talking about like communicating with the partner. So again, what are the 2 best points? Especially if you're on the front half, you don't have too much time, you're going to speak pretty quickly, you want to really flesh it out. And then you want to think, what is the main clash? So what do we have to do to win the debate? Which is a pretty big question, right? You don't know what the opposition are going to say. You don't really know necessarily like what you're going to say yet. But normally when you think about a debate, it'll probably come down to like 2 or 3 main questions, right? So take for a second, think about the debate that we were talking about before. You know, should parking tickets be relative to wealth? Should rich people pay more than poor people, basically, right? So think about that. Think about that motion. What do you think the debate comes down to, right? Like what is the big question we're asking ourselves when we're having that debate and that discussion? When I think about that, I would say the question probably becomes, you know, should the amount of money or like punishment people have be relative to their amount of ability to give to it, right? So should it be the case that it's relative to your income and not just an overall, I guess, punishment that's the same for everybody? So there's a few things you might have to prove, right? You might have to prove harm. So if we're on that side gov that rich people should pay more, you could talk about kind of like I mentioned before, where it's like the harm that happens to poor people. If let's say, you know, food costs money, if I have to pay a $100 parking ticket and I also need to like, I don't know, feed my family, I probably think that feeding my family is more important. And if I have to give that money away, the $100, worse things could happen to me because I need that money. So that's just kind of a big picture idea. If you and your partner disagree about the most important points, which that can be hard if, Hannah brings up some pretty cool stuff and Richard brings up some pretty cool stuff. And Hannah and Richard are both like, but my points are the most important points in the round. At a certain point, you probably just need to come to a decision about what to include and not to include. And unfortunately, the first speaker normally does just make that decision because they have to be the most comfortable with the content. So they have to be able to actually speak about it because they're speaking first. They're bringing the case forward the most. So when it comes down to it, let's say you guys aren't sure who's going to speak first. And Hannah's like, well, actually, like, I'm willing to speak first. It probably will be her content. But you should try to compromise as much as possible. Maybe have 2 points if you can, and go from there. Go over any uncertainties within the framing and definitions of the round. Does the motion mean the same thing to both of you, right? So do you both get what wealth is, or like rich and poor, etc.? And then also, like I said, deciding who is speaking first or second. Then going on to deciding on the case, here's some stuff just about how to determine the right case, right? So the right case for you is one that you understand. You don't want to just be like, oh, I heard one time on TV that like parking tickets should be, I don't know, like $3,000. I heard this one time, but like, let's just go with it, right? Because I've heard it somewhere. And then just try to explain it. You don't want to just say the case that you've heard before. You want to make sure it's something you can answer questions about. So when somebody asks a POI and says, but what did you mean by this specific thing, you actually know what you're talking about. That's much more important. Another question to ask yourself is it fair? So can the other team reasonably debate against it with the framing you have? Right. So if you just create a case that's like, there's no opposition to this case, there's nothing that can take this down at all, but it's not reasonable. It's not like the opposition doesn't have to argue something like really, really bad, or doesn't have to live in a world that's super fake. That's something you can consider. Another one is, does it have a big impact, right? So you might know a case about something that is true, but then you think about it and you're like, actually, like, the consequences of this happening aren't that big. They don't impact that many people, or, it's not that bad when this happens. You want to think about the biggest impact, the most things that are happening. And then another one, is it relevant to the motion, right? Like somebody can get up and give a great speech about like lizards and reptiles, and that's pretty cool. But if the motion's not about lizards or reptiles, then it's probably not the right case. And that can be difficult, right? Because sometimes you just want to talk about things that you like, or that you know about, or that are good. And that's pretty fun to do that. But especially when you're trying to win a debate round, you want to make sure it's the thing that the round is about. And then lastly, does it engage well with the general ideas of what you believe the round will look like? So if you're thinking about the op case and you have an idea of what they're going to run, if we're talking about this house would ban zoos, right? So we don't want like where they keep animals in cages to exist. We don't want zoos anymore. If you can consider that on the op side for not banning zoos, they're going to talk about like endangered species and how like animals have a right to exist in certain places, or like how you only have zoos that keep them alive. If you can think that that's what they're going to say, you want to make sure that your case has a way to hit it, right? So you want to make sure that you're not talking about something completely over here. You want to make sure that when the judge is listening to you, they can go, okay, I'm comparing these two things. These two things are related to each other. What is better? So just thinking about the round in advance is good. Okay. Then talking about case flushing and response prep. So this is the last 5 minutes of prep. So you and your partner should have like an idea of what you're going to run. You feel confident and good. But now the first speaker is going to flesh out your argumentation. We can talk about this in later weeks if you guys aren't familiar before. But thumbs up if you're familiar with PALE. Like, has anybody ever taught you PALE? PALE, we've heard of PALE. Okay, some of us have heard of PALE. But PALE is point, analysis, example, and link. So you have your first idea, then you have your explanation of your idea, you have an example, so a time that it happened, and then you have a link. So why is this important to the motion? So really fleshing out your argumentation. A reminder, are these points relevant? Have I given enough context for the argumentation to work? So have I explained what words mean? Have I explained how this relates to the motion and not just asserted it? And do I understand the importance of these arguments? Do I get why they have an impact? Then the second speaker, like I said before, should be thinking about the op case. And this is because then it's way easier to pre-butt and come up with responses ahead of time. Because you don't want to like feel like you're all that in a bag of chips and then go up and then you have no idea what the op is going to run and you're like surprised and you're like, oh my goodness, I had no clue. But if I had taken 2 minutes, I might have realized and had longer to think about what I'll say back. So that second speaker is going to think about the basics of the op case. And then you're going to think, okay, what is our case? What is the basics of the op case? And how do these two things cross each other or butt heads? And that's what you're going to really, really focus on. Then what pre-buttal and responses will work? And what are the main clashes? So then you kind of think, okay, you know, this argument goes with this argument that we have really responds well to this other one. I'll make sure to write that down and make sure to use this when I respond. You can start to do some of that work pretty early on. Does anybody have questions so far about how this kind of works? Or does this feel okay? You don't have to have this memorized by any means. Feeling okay? Thumbs up. Thumbs up okay. Thumbs down, we're not feeling okay. Maybe a thumbs up. Maybe an in between. Okay, we'll keep going. And then we're gonna get started into some debating. Okay, awesome. So that's my prep ideas. Does anybody have any questions about prep on the whole? Is there anything that's confusing? Feel free to just go for it. No? Okay. So the motion we're going to use today, and we're going to explain it. I'm going to put in the chat any clarifications we have. So this House would make the right to vote contingent on basic knowledge about political issues. So it sounds way scarier than it is, okay? It sounds really scary. It's really not scary. So basically the motion is saying on-site government, you would only let people vote. So think about like politics, elections, or if like you have at your school like a student council, if you've ever been in like a club or anything. So the right to vote, so the right to make decisions is based on if you have knowledge about political issues. So let's say there was a student council, right? Everybody's familiar with like a student council where students are like able to kind of make choices and there's roles and that kind of stuff. So let's say the only way I could vote for Hannah in the student council election, because Hannah's running for president, Hannah wants to run the whole place. The only way I can vote for Hannah is if I can prove that I like know the things Hannah wants to do. So I know that Hannah wants to make recess longer. I know that the principals and the teachers don't want recess to be longer. I'm like aware of what's going on. If I know what Hannah's gonna do or like what she wants, then I'm allowed to vote. But if Richard came up to me and said, do you know what Hannah wants to do? And I said, not sure. I don't know what Hannah wants to do. Then I don't get to vote. So the idea of this round is, should you have to be like engaged in your community? Should you have to like know things about things in order to have